Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Demographic Drought. My name is Ron Hetrick, Senior Labor Economist and Director of Staffing Product here at MZ Burning Glass. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you a deck that we put together around the article that we wrote earlier this year called the Demographic Drought. It's also called the sansdemic meaning without people. So with that in mind, let's just jump right in. We're going to be covering this in kind of a sequence. It works best if we talk about this in order. So we're going to talk about what life was like before everything kind of went off the rails last year in March 2020 with the COVID situation and then with the shutdowns. We're then going to talk about what's going on now, and we're going to see how what was going on in the past is really being hammered into place with where we are right now. And then we're going to talk about where we're going with this. You know, how is this going to resolve itself? At the very end, we're going to have just a couple slides on, you know, what can you do about this? It's probably a little discouraging that you can't do more, but at least there are some things that we can do. And part of those is just hope that maybe things get a little bit better. So with this in mind, we're going to talk about pre-COVID. And really the shaping issue with this were the baby boomers. In the article, we spend a lot of time talking about this generation. They changed everything. They were so huge as a population. But more than anything, because we're talking about the labor market, the significance of them with this is that women in particular came in at the same time doing greater education. So you have a husband and a wife now both going to college, both contributing to the workforce, and they're doing it over a long period of time. And if we look in this slide, this is just women. You can see how dramatically they shot up as a force in our labor force and really kind of doubled our supply of labor over the course of time from the late 60s, early 70s up into the mid 90s. So you have this population, and we were just saying that, they came in, but they were also educated. And you see these curves, but notice the curve for women, which is that bottom one. You know, it kind of stays a little bit lower, and then it just fires upward, and you can see that it has actually overtaken males. So you have two populations earning a lot of money, going through. How much money did they earn? Well, they just went crazy. So this is something that's really kind of crazy. If you don't understand too much about economics, they'll talk about things as in current dollars or constant dollars or real dollars. And real dollars means we take it, we're basically considering inflation into this. So this way we can say, look, the price of this is the same as it would have been back then. We can kind of adjust these things. And if we look at it, real median household earnings in 1955 were $5,000. Over a 20-year period, they went from $5,000 to $14,000, or $9,000 gain. But what happens when you have two professionals working for 40 years together? Well, what happens is household income goes skyrocketing. So we went from $14,075 to a massive $56,000 just 20 years later. So two 20-year periods. 5,000 to 14,000, 9,000, then another 20 years, and we jump 42,000. It's incredibly important that we understand that this bundle of money that's being earned, what that can do to our society and what it's doing also to the way we look at labor and just the driven force that they were. So another part of this, here's the problem. So you have this population going through, they're earning a lot of money, they're changing everything about how we view labor, and then they all start retiring. And so if you look at this, think of this like a tidal wave. So this tidal wave formed out in the ocean. It was going on over a great period of time. We're living in the time that this thing is crashing to shore. So what we were feeling throughout most of our lifetimes, many of the people watching this, was this really large driven labor force earning all this money, and we wrote really detailed job descriptions and we made adjustments to the way we use labor, and now these people are all exiting out the other side. And what that's done is right before COVID struck, we had set a record low unemployment rate of 3.5% for that's non-war time. So that's what happens. It also is these people are exiting, and we were really consuming labor. Because they were exiting, we didn't have people behind replacing, which we're going to talk about later. you can see that this is really going to start to get pretty tight. This is before COVID once again. We had 7 million job openings, which was a record. We had 6 million people who wanted a job but weren't in the labor force. And then we had about 5.9 million people who were actually unemployed. So it basically was giving us about 2 people for every open job, and one of them couldn't work at this particular time. This is before COVID. And then if you go back to that time, if less people to fill these jobs, we had record job openings, we had quit rates were firing up. And then if we look, people on the sidelines, so people who are saying, hey, you know what? I'm not really interested in working anymore. Like these people who actually want to stay employed, that number was going down. And what's really important here, and really important, is for people above the age of 55, that number of people who are out of the labor force and saying, I don't want to work anymore, was increasing in percentage and volume. So this concept that the boomers were going to work way longer than the people before them was not true. And if you look back a couple of slides, when we talk about how much they made, that's pretty much the biggest reason. They don't have to stay and work forever and ever because they made enough money to retire comfortably. So another big thing that happens at this time is millennials now take over for boomers as the predominant part of the labor force. I'm a Gen Xer. We were smaller and kind of crunched in the middle, but the millennials took over as the predominant, that prime age workforce. And when they came in, as the millennials are coming in, the boomers are exited, we noticed something really interesting happening. Labor force participation dropped. So labor force participation is a rate. It's a percentage. So this is not about people, one group of people leaving and they're really large and they're not being replaced by another large group. It talks about the percentage of people who could work, who are choosing to work or not to work. And so if you look at that line, this insane line, when the boomers were coming in, that line's skyrocketing. Once the boomers start to exit out of the labor force, our labor force participation rate suffers more and more and more as the millennials kind of take over that part. And we're going to dig in a lot more deeply on that. The number of working prime age men in particular. So this is a population that we're really concerned about. It's certainly a problem that we're experiencing right now as we look at, a lot of the jobs we're struggling to fill in manufacturing, construction, warehousing. That working prime age men population was dropping, and this labor force participation rate dropping down, that went down 5 percentage points, represents millions of men, and they're not there anymore. We look at females, they were kind of meandering about, they go up and they go down, but for men, it's a clear downward trend. Prime age men were separating away from the labor force. Another really fascinating factor that was going on, all of this happening before COVID, we had boomers retiring, we had millennials coming in but not working as much, not as interested in working. And then another factor was the amount of people choosing to work part-time, not working part-time because they have to, because that's the only thing available, but working part-time because they want to do that. And you see that number taking off. In particular, one of those groups that really liked part-time, we're back to prime age men again. And so these two lines, messed up a little bit by what happened here with COVID, but these two lines represent divergent trends in part-time. This is prime age men choosing to work part-time jobs over full-time, and this is them doing part-time because that's all they can find. And here's how we kind of illustrate this out. This is it's a ridiculously overcomplicated table, so I'm just going to use one thing on here. Basically what this is something produced by ADP, and they look at people's paychecks and they go, they were last working for this industry, and then they went to work for these industries. And one of the most fascinating things on this is the manufacturing line. People who were working for manufacturing, around 30%, were leaving to go into retail trade or go into some level of trade. And if you look, that doesn't reciprocate. So people leaving retail trade, if we find trades line, which is right here, they only come about 7.8%. So just a huge mismatch of people leaving manufacturing to go to trade, but not leaving trade to go to manufacturing. So that brings us to the present. And we've titled this slide, not just a perfect storm, but it's a hurricane, tornado, and an earthquake rolled into one. And you're going to see how all of these things that were taking place before really got hammered down when COVID and then the shutdowns happened and what we've done since then. So one of our biggest problems, and one of the reasons why we're feeling so much pain now, is our labor force participation rate, which was already not doing well, plunged. And if you look, it never recovers. So this is now a year later of hitting a flat line at this really low level. That is very concerning. I mean, these extra 2 percentage points, once again, that's millions of people, but they're not coming back in. They're not re-participating in the labor force. And we have the amount of people who are unemployed. We send a lot of people to unemployment. We get a quick correction and then flatline. And we flatlined for the better part of a year now. Very recently, in the past 2 months, this number's starting to improve much better, but still just not getting back down to where we were. People who were out of the labor force, we talked about labor force participation. These are people who said, I'm out of the labor force. I don't want to work anymore. These are the actual numbers. So you can actually see we lose these people. We go from around 95 million to over almost 103 million. We start to get these people coming back and then they flatline again. So we need this 5 million people to come back in, but they're not coming back in. So what happens when you do this now? This morning, this number was posted at 10 million. So, but even before that, 9.2 million, these are all-time records. Remember pre-COVID, we said 7 million was an all-time record. Well, 7 million looks like chump change now because now we're up at the 10 million mark. And so these would be the amount of job openings that we have. And you can just see this just soaring through the stratosphere. And obviously we know that a lot of that is because those flat lines that we saw with labor force participation. But just this economy that we kind of strangled for a little bit is trying to unleash and get back to where it was. And we need people to do it, but the people aren't there. So the postings just keep compounding and compounding. The big problem that we have here, and this is something that really is worth understanding, is we have changed as a country. Years ago, a fellow wrote a book. It was called Factfulness by Hans Rosling. And in that book, Hans Rosling goes and he talks to all kinds of associations, universities, high-level people, very educated people, and he asks them basic questions about the world. How many children does the average woman in Africa have? How many people in the world live in extreme poverty? How many people don't know how to read? And what happens is he collects all the answers, and the answers are answers that are consistent with the way things were in the 1960s, but wildly off of where they are now in present society. That's kind of what we're dealing with here in the U.S. There is a concept that we have in our minds that the average Joe in America is a non-college educated blue-collar worker. We're always looking out for that average Joe, but the average Joe is not what you think it is. If we look at our labor force over the age of 25, we find out that the predominant group of people at least have an associate's degree. The very largest group of people have a bachelor's degree. And then we see over here, we have 35 million with just a high school diploma, and then 9 million without a high school diploma. The problem that you have also with people who have lower levels of education is they don't participate in the labor force, very low participation rates versus someone with college. Look at that 44% for people without a high school diploma, 72% for someone with college. So we have this group of people. This is your average Joe. They're actually pretty educated. Well, this would be great, except when you look at the job openings that we have, that switches back around. So we have around 6 million, roughly 2 out of every 3 job openings we have are for low-skilled people. But we only have 3.4 million low-skilled people. You can see the demand is way greater than supply. We actually do have a lot of college-educated people for a much smaller number of college openings. So this crisis that we're feeling is not a crisis. In the past, we'd talk about STEM shortages. We have STEM shortages. We don't have enough IT people. We don't have enough mathematicians and engineers. Now, what we have and what we're all feeling every day as we drive through our towns and see help wanted signs everywhere, including the McDonald's I just drove by for $15 an hour, is because of this. Demand greatly outstripping supply, therefore price has to adjust. So in the past, we would solve this problem, that 6 million, that 3.4 million, with immigration. Now, events of last year, because remember, we said COVID took everything that was already going wrong and then made it worse. So immigration had been going down year after year after year. And then COVID, because of border, closings and things like that, we just lost completely. Immigration was gone. By the second half of 2020, there was no immigration. So you're talking about, we're getting 500,000 people sometimes through immigration, and you cut that supply off. So now you're compounding this problem of we don't have the workforce that we think we have. We have a very educated workforce, not an uneducated workforce. Our teen population is very engaged. They're going to college. Very few of them are unemployed, enough to make a difference. And then immigration, which is where we've always solved this problem historically, also through the floor, not going to help us out right now. Now, as we look at all those things, we want to kind of dial this back and say, so what was it about last year? What was it about COVID and the resulting shutdowns and everything that caused everything to really get so much worse? If we talk about that first section again, we're going to kind of circle back up. So we lost 21 million jobs, but a lot of the people that lost their jobs were on temporary furlough. These were not people who were really displaced. They were people who were inconvenienced. They were out of a job. Some of them some of these people ended up permanently losing their job. But a lot of people were like, look, I'm going to get my job back. I'm going to wait this thing out. So that's the first one. We have a mindset of people that were not, dying to get another job, didn't make a quick jump to another industry because in their minds, they were going to eventually get their job back. Now, as part of that was we started going, okay, because we're shutting down some things and you can't go to work, we're going to give out assistance payments. And so 2 programs were born, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program and the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program. If you look, regular unemployment, which is what comes out every month and people focus on, it's actually a very small number. When we're thinking about trying to fill these job openings, it's not this one that we really need to be concerned about. These are the programs that are really causing a lot of the issues because those people who are like, look, I'm eventually going to work again, but you know what? It's nice to get this kind of assistance. So it lowers the need to make a quick decision. You can be very patient about how you re-engage. Now, the big question I get every time I speak is, well, will they return to work when the aid ends? And there are still problems. The aid is in the economy. So this is our money supply here. Well, this is the money underneath the Fed's control. So we're going around $4 trillion for a long period of time. This is what that aid looks like. So we have $4 trillion excess dollars sitting in our economy. And if you think about those programs, whether it's PEUA, PEUC, or even the CARES Act checks that we received, that went to households. And so household median income skyrocketed. Now, household median income was already going up, but it absolutely exploded last year. There's a lot of money. So when people say, well, people return when the aid ends, the reality is eventually, most likely, but we've made it so that it's very easy to coast for a while. Now, another problem that we have, of course, with all of this stuff, we have COVID, and part of this big problem that we have is fear. In fact, there's a resurge now, and it jars everything up because, people's fear, they're not quite sure what they want to do. Well, the boomers, we already know. We were looking at that tidal wave, and that tidal wave of retirements. Last year, the boomers really retired to the tune of about 1.2, maybe up to 1.5 million excess boomers. So when you're talking about all of these jobs that we're trying to fill, you're now another million plus out. They're not coming back. The stock market crushed it last year. Any retirement accounts these people had did really well. They're out. They're not coming back. So as we start to do the math and go, okay, how do we get back to equilibrium? Well, we have to immediately subtract this group out because they're not coming back. Now, this is a really shocking survey that was done by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and this is really going to kind of drive home everything that we were just talking about. So what they did, this was in May of this year, they went to 9.3 million people who had originally lost their jobs. So they were in that first spike of layoffs that occurred during the pandemic, and they said, what are you planning to do? How are you going to be looking? Are you going to be returning to work? And these were very disheartening numbers. So of this 9.3 million people that they interviewed, 1.2 million said, I'm never working ever again. Now, this is consistent with what we were just talking about with, the excess boomer retirements. There may be some other people here that just were like, hey, this stay-at-home life suits me well. They're gone. So 13%, they're done. Another 1.6 million said, I'm going to work, but not in 2021. I'll come back next year. So we've knocked off another 17%. They're not coming back in 2021. Remember, we're trying to answer the question, will people return when the aid ends? Then we get up to this next group. This is my favorite group. We've got 38% of them who say, yeah, but they're not looking for a job. So they're like, well, yeah, I'm going to work, but they're not actually looking. So this is a really difficult group to know, well, what are they going to do and when are they going to do it? Because they say, yeah, I'm going to return, but they're not actually engaging in work. So the rest of them, the 32%, so 1 out of every 3, are actually actively looking for a job. So 1 out of every 3 of this 9.3 million are saying, yes, I'm looking for a job. So once again, as we look at all of these job openings, these compounding problems, one of the biggest problems that we have is, we were talking about earlier, that people who lost their jobs were like, well, it's temporary. And then they kind of figured out how to survive on that. Then there was aid that kind of contributed to that as well. And now people don't have that hunger to kind of jump back in. Another issue, and this is particularly true with prime age men, is we had a tremendous increase in drug overdoses last year. So this has been an issue that's been affecting prime age men for many, many years. And we actually estimate almost 900,000 men are out of the labor force because of some level of opioid addiction. So it's not just the deaths that really hurt us, and those profoundly hurt everybody, but just the people who are struggling with addiction are also not working. So it's yet another thing that keeps compounding on top of it. So we can just see, just that gain year over year that we had. So we talked about what it was like pre-COVID. Boomers, huge population, they're retiring, millennials come in, they're less interested in working. There's a switch to part-time. Then we look at what happened last year and really kind of drove all of those points home even more boomer retirements than ever. All these issues kind of compounding. So now we're going to look at the future. The biggest problem that we have right now, and the main point of demographic drought, was that we as a country stopped having babies at some point in the early 70s. So there's a replacement rate of 2.1, and I'm not going to go into the details of how that's computed, but 2.1 is a replacement rate. A woman's going to have 2.1, each woman has 2.1 children, and the population is able to stay the same. We have not hit 2.1, as you can see, since the early 70s. So our population is not at a replacement level. Once again, we usually made up for this with immigration. We're going to show in a second that that's an interesting thing, because when you look at the rest of the world, there's also an issue going on. But this is the first thing. So if babies weren't being born back in the 70s or 80s, then a labor force is not coming. So as the boomers leave, there's not a labor force waiting to take over because we have less and less people. Here's something just to kind of illustrate that. So this is that replacement rate. This is in 2003. In blue, that's good. You're above the replacement rate. And you can see a number of the states. We had 15 states that were above 2.1. The map is actually not that offensive. When we jumped to 2017, I think we got Utah and South Dakota, not our 2 most populous states, are the only ones who are at replacement level, and they're at replacement level. They're not blowing it away. Everybody else way below replacement level. The Northeast really struggling. Of course, the West Coast, same. So you can see that it's not any particular thing that's going wrong here. It's everybody as a country, we're just having less children. And then last year, we set our lowest birth rate ever in our history. So you have a whole map, all states went into the red. A lot of that was because women were afraid to go to the hospital, or if there were complications with their pregnancy, they didn't want to have to deal with what was going on in the hospitals, so people just decided not to have children, which is the exact opposite of what everybody thought was going to happen. Hey, we all get locked in our homes, fertility should shoot through the roof. Wrong. It actually was the opposite. The fear kind of overtook that. So this is our population growth by decade, and this is just crazy when you look back at American history. Our population growth of 2010 to 2020 matched where it was right coming out of the Great Depression, when people were very afraid to have children because you couldn't feed the children that you had. And yet we replicated that in the past 10 years without a crisis. We have seen our rates plunge so much in that time frame. Now, this chart here is just basically saying, if we look at the working age, population. So this is, let's keep this under that kind of 65, 75 upper year boundary, your 16-year-olds. So these are really looking at people who we consider our working age population. And we look at the change from 2011 to 2021. Find your area on this map. You're most likely to find red. There are some blues. We do see some of this obviously is migration, people moving to Florida, Texas, on the West Coast. That's a lot of this. But also just understand that so much of the country is seeing their working age population contracting at this particular point in time. And then if you say, well, maybe it'll get better, this is your answer. So this is the same map, but now we're looking at people who are under the age of 15. So these are the people going to come up to replace the people who are not there, and they're not there either. So we're still seeing a negative change in most of the country for people who are under 15. So, it's just... It's making sure that we understand that the problem's not going to get better. It's just something we have to deal with. So the problem that we also in this is that as you're having fewer children, college enrollment is declining. You can kind of see the dismal projections here as we look out, how enrollment's going to fall. This is something else that, college and universities have to start to take into account. And many of them are. They're starting to plan for the future. But there was something that came out from Korea a couple of weeks ago. And in that, they were saying that they're combining elementary schools and they're just knocking down a lot of the schools because their birth rate's so much lower than even the U.S. But there's a lot of countries that have this where they actually are now having to bring schools together to contract the amount of schools that they have. Now, this is something that you really have to kind of pay attention to this, but this is the number of people in our population by age, by year. So this is age 22 at the top, all the way down to less than a year old. If you look at this, what you see is this tapering. It just keeps coming in. So that tells us that every year going forward, because this is, as of 2019, each year that another group comes up, comes prime age or starts to work, goes into college, each year, with a couple exceptions, that's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller for at least the next 20-something years. It's just going to keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. At some point, we become out of balance. So we have, if we look at this graph, only 60% of our total population will be within working age by the year 2100. So this really starts to keep flipping upside down. And this is where we start to talk about, going over that edge where you start to contract as an economy, you start to contract as a population, because the amount of people who are older are greatly outweighing the amount of people that actually are working, maybe doing Social Security or paying taxes to try to support everybody else. That group that's going to be that one supporting everybody else is going to continuously get more and more out of whack. So just another fun thing to think about for the future. I know it's really great. So this is one of the last things I want to leave on this particular section, and that is what we're feeling in the U.S., this labor crunch, this lack of children, this not being able to replace ourselves is common throughout the entire world. Now, obviously, much more in the highly developed nations, but at the bottom of this graph, you have Korea, which is, I think, 0.6, Italy, Japan, all hovering around 1. We just said that we've been doing 1.7, and that's terrible for us. We're not even coming close. These countries are way, way below where we are. And then you have, basically, you can't even see for the world. This is the important thing to understand. In every country, everybody's birth rates are coming down. We no longer are a world that is just surging with population. We actually are a world that birth rates are coming down, and a lot of the world is not at replacement rate. China went to a one-child policy, so they forced a one. And now they're desperately trying to figure out how they're going to afford to pay for their aging workers when there's no population in behind them. So you can see that everybody's going to try to solve this dilemma. So if there are other countries in the world where you think you can get labor, understand that everybody's going to try to get those people at the same time, because they're all feeling this hurt of not having enough people. So this problem that is a U.S. problem is a problem everywhere. And what that means is the answer isn't going to be, well, I'm just going to go get people and bring them here, because everybody needs to get people. And then those people are also becoming less and less and less. We looked at immigration going down every year. Well, one of the reasons is because the world itself, populations that we would normally draw from are also getting lower. So this brings us to the last section, which is the what can you do? Now, if you look at a lot of what we're talking about, these are systemic long-term issues. There's not a whole lot you can do. You can't get in a time machine and go back and tell everybody, hey, have more children. And you can't fix a lot of the things that have been going into place. I mean, this boomer thing has been going on for 50, 60, 70 years. So you can't undo these types of things. So if this is the reality that we're in, then there are some things that we need to consider. So here's a couple of these things here. Now, the thing that I'm not a fan of is this concept of raising wages. You see it now everywhere, all the fast food places and everybody, they've got signs up, and it just becomes this wage game. And wages everybody kind of loses, well, except you could say, well, the workers win, but even then, that's not exactly true as well, because it's kind of when the floor comes up, everybody's pay goes up and the cost of everything goes up as well. So that's not a great long-term answer. Finding non-wage things, finding what's really great about your business and learning how to sell that to people. Take the passion you have as business owners, take the passion you have as somebody who's highly tenured in your company, and learn how to get that passion to that next group of people. For the love of everything, please simplify your job descriptions. You can't simplify them enough. I highly recommend, putting job descriptions up that are like, find me somebody good. Find me somebody who communicates well. And you take on more of the burden on yourself. And so this last one becomes the most important part, because if I simplify my job requirements, that means that I need to become phenomenal at training. I need to be able to brag about how fast I can get someone trained in being a productive member of my workforce. So this is something we got away from because of the boomers once again, and everybody having all these skills. We started getting rid of our training departments because you put a posting out, everybody who applied for it was qualified. Now you put a posting out and no one's applying. So now you have to shift the burden back on your companies to take over those particular things. On the second page, some of the longer term things. One of the biggest frustrations I have is as we're dealing with this crisis, I hear of HR managers who are just so frustrated. Just talked to somebody this past week who said, her boss was like, what is going on with you? Like, where is everybody? Like, why aren't we filling our jobs? As if HR people can control what's happening in the demographics reality that surrounds us. And I think that's the problem is we've pushed this issue into HR, but this is a boardroom level conversation. Workforce planning needs to elevate out of HR. It needs to become something that companies go, okay, here's our sales goals for the year. Here's the new products we're thinking of developing. And here's how we're going to approach our labor force problem. Here's how we're going to make sure that we're utilizing labor most effectively. Here's how we're going to attract talent. Here's how we're going to keep them there. Those kind of things, ultra critical. Part and parcel to this is having a plan to identify really good people and get them moving along, promote them. Don't let people quit. We've become a country that's so sloppy when it comes to attrition. We were always like, they quit, so what? But we can't do it anymore because now there's no guarantee you're going to get another person like the one you just lost. If it's something easy to take care of, then take care of it. You can't fix everything. Some people are going to quit for all kinds of reasons, life reasons, because they were given a phenomenal opportunity they always dreamed of. You can't do anything about that. But the kind of quitting that because a manager is a jerk or because you're not flexible at all with your hours, that kind of stuff is all easily addressable. So I highly recommend just thinking about those kind of things. How can you get your good people to stay? And what can you do to kind of do the exit interviews? And what can you do to try to keep people there? This last part is something that really starting to encourage now, which is partner with institutions that may be able to supply you with labor. It's a bit of a riskier play, but this partnering with prisons is something that everybody's starting to look into. The state will bear risk. There are programs in every state. Go to your state, talk to the prison system and say, hey, look, I really need people in my manufacturing plant or my work site. Can we come in and start training them now? And then we'll just start slowly working them in until their exit date. And that way, we can have them come on full time. That is something that we really need to take advantage of that workforce because we haven't done it enough. And then just once again, partnering with colleges, high schools, telling them, here are our needs, man. Can we talk to these kids? These schools are there to serve their communities. It's not the other way around. They're there to serve all of your businesses. But you have to let them know, this is what I'm looking for, and can you get in front of these kids, and can you let them know, like, hey, this is the industry I'm in, and it doesn't look good on the surface, but we create these products, and they're phenomenal products, and I want to talk to you about them because here's what your career could look like there. Everybody needs to have that mindset of doing that. And that is the demographic drought, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.